They asked me to speak at this to talk about aquaculture, which I know most of you probably don't have a lot of interest in or background in. So my talk will be a little bit different in that I'm going to cover a good bit of background information just to kind of bring you up to where we are. And this theme of this pre-symposium of Start Healthy, End Strong, when I first started thinking about how am I going to relate health management in fish to swine, it was kind of an intimidating thing. But the more I learned about it, the more the two do seem to have similar goals in mind. And with us, with our fish, particularly now that we're seeing more and more of the in-house or indoor closed recirculating system culture, it becomes even more important. Somebody sent me this slide or this picture, and it was representative of a group of pigs that are very happy and in an environment where they're just really comfortable. And I was thinking, you know, if I saw that, if I saw a fish in a pond like that, I would say, no, that's definitely not good. So the outline of my talk today is, first of all, again, we'll do a little background. Why do we need domestic aquaculture? The introduction to some aquaculture systems. We'll talk about a couple of examples because with aquaculture, it's not one size fits all. It's like there's so many different species being cultured, so many different systems. I had to narrow it down to two so we could actually understand some of this. So we're going to talk about catfish pond culture and tilapia culture in freshwater closed systems, and then the prevention and control of disease in those systems. Obviously, there's a tremendous demand for seafood worldwide, and what we've learned is that the global wild harvest can't be sustained, and it's leveled off. It may even be declining. Present global aquaculture production is nearly 60 million tons, and to meet the increased demand for this seafood, we feel like the world's going to need an additional 40 million tons from aquaculture by 2030. So where does this aquaculture take place? 90% of it takes place in either China or other parts of Southeast Asia. 6.7% is from Latin America and the Caribbean, and unfortunately only 1% is from the North America. So, what are we looking at in this country? 86% of the seafood consumed in the U.S. right now is imported, and 40% of those imports come from aquaculture. Here's the really bad news. The U.S. annual seafood trade deficit is over $9 billion. Based on our population growth projections, this is just going to increase, and we think domestic aquaculture could help offset this. Now, I really like to show this slide as a frustrated saltwater fisherman. I just dream of those days when I might see a catch like this. But back in the 80s, or in the late 70s, early 80s, we felt like the Gulf of Mexico was this unlimited source of seafood and fish, and it could never be overfished or overexploited. But along that time, a chef down here in New Orleans named Paul Prudhomme came up with a recipe for blackened redfish. And all of a sudden, there was a tremendous demand for this fish that before nobody really knew about or cared that much about. So what the commercial fishermen did was they sent spotter planes out into the Gulf. They would spot these big schools of red drum. They would encircle that school with purse seine and pull in the entire school, thousands of pounds of brood redfish. This is the brood stock that was producing offspring support the fishery. So we found out very quickly that you could really hurt the fishery. So that kind of fueled, again, the idea that maybe aquaculture would be a way to offset that. The redfish is very regulated now. It has sport fish status. The U.S. aquaculture industry, even though it's small, it's still $1 billion industry. Catfish is the leading species. Crawfish is number 2. Trout, salmon, oysters, and tilapia. In Louisiana, crawfish is king, followed by oysters and alligators. While you're here, I hope you enjoy all 3 of those. If you have the opportunity to visit some of our restaurants, try those. I think you'll enjoy them, especially the crawfish. We're right in the middle of crawfish season right now. So I'm going to focus on warm water aquaculture. Again, it's one size doesn't fit all. There's all these different types of cold water aquaculture, but I'm not going to talk about that. So the catfish industry is the top industry in the U.S., and this is practiced in these intensive open pond freshwater systems, earthen ponds, mostly in the Mississippi Delta. The crawfish, on the other hand, are not intensively raised. They're very low density production in these big ponds that are often alternated with crops of rice. And you see the old Cajun combine there in the bottom right corner. That's just running traps and collecting the crawfish. What we'll talk about later in this presentation is the intensive closed recirculating systems. We're seeing more and more of these going in. A lot of them are going in the north and in the Midwest, utilizing long raceways, as they're called, long rectangular tanks, each one with its own biological filter and air supply, and we'll talk about that more in detail later. One thing that we've been looking at for quite a long time, actually, is the idea that we could see some aquaculture in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's been a lot of opposition to this, lots of different delays in getting this done. But as of January the 11th of this year, NOAA is going to allow permitting for putting fish farms in the Gulf of Mexico. And what you're seeing here in the middle is kind of an artist's conception of what one of these might look like, where you could take a derelict oil rig and turn it into a base of operations for a fish farm. But if you're putting cages in the Gulf, they're going to have to be like those at the top left or the bottom left, where you would have a submersible cage where you could take it down to about at least 100 feet and get it out of that surge from hurricanes that would come through. You wouldn't be able to use the floating cages like are depicted in that photo. So this slide was actually inspired by my old professor, Dr. John Plum, but this is the kind of thing that we look at when we're talking about things that influence fish health. And of course, we already talked about the facilities and how they're different, and how that may affect the way the fish are handled and grown. The environment, to me, is kind of the most important component of this, because just like with your swine production units, the environment makes a tremendous difference in the performance of the animals. With fish, you've got this other dimension that comes in, and that's the fact that the fish are living in the aquatic environment. They're living in their own metabolic wastes. So water quality is of utmost importance. And because they're cold-blooded animals, their body temperature becomes the temperature of the water they're in. And changing water temperatures make a tremendous difference in how their immune system functions. So I can't go into too much detail on that. But at the top left there, the physiological status block is related to environment and how that immunity is affected. I tend to be more interested in the pathogens, the host-pathogen relationships, and the thing that we see with fish is this very strong host specificity. Certain species of bacteria, certain strains of a particular species may be very specific for a certain species of fish. So we have to be aware of all that in our management. So let's go back and talk about catfish aquaculture now, because it's probably one of the better examples I can use as to how disease is actually managed in aquaculture. The catfish are raised in these 10 to 20 acre earthen ponds. They're stocked very densely at sometimes up to 10,000 fish per acre. Feeding rates are very high now. It's progressed over the years, but now we're up to about 200 pounds per acre per day. But the fish do convert the feed very well. Usually about 1.5 to 1 would be your conversion ratio. And production is up to about 6,000 pounds per acre. Most of the catfish industry is located in the southeast. It's either in, Mississippi is the biggest state. It kind of goes in the order I have them there. Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Texas, and then Louisiana's kind of hanging on by a thread. We really don't have much of an industry anymore. But at the height of the catfish industry, which would have been around 2003 to 2005, we'd see maybe 600 million pounds of fish produced each year. But we've run into quite a number of problems with this industry. The first one, as I mentioned, we're seeing these production levels increase. Fish farmers are no different from farmers that grow any other crop. They're going to push the limit as far as they can, and so water quality becomes a limiting factor. We got hit with the same problems that other commodity groups did with rising feed costs. The catfish feeds cost about $306 a ton now. The thing that really knocked the catfish industry in the head, though, was the imported basa. The basa is a pangasius catfish that they grow in Vietnam, and it has really hurt the industry. So they're still struggling with that. And then, of course, infectious disease. Catfish production has not changed much over the years. They have spawning ponds that begin this hatchery phase that is in May and June. In the spawning ponds, they'll put metal cans out. The female will go in the can, lay the egg mass. The male then chases the female out. He goes in, fans the eggs until they hatch. But the hatchery manager is going to go out there and take the egg mass out of the can before they hatch and bring them indoors into the hatchery where they can be more carefully monitored. Then you have nursery ponds, which are stocked June through October. You'll have this fingerling production phase, and then you have the grow-out phase, which is basically year-round. Now, the catfish industry they sort of took a wrong turn, I think, at some point. And I was looking at some information on your swine production where you use the all-in, all-out system. And that's the way catfish were produced originally. They would stock a pond, grow that crop of fish out to market size, they would drain the pond and harvest the whole pond. And then they could renovate and get everything back in good shape. But somewhere along the line, the idea came in that they needed year-round production. So, I mean, obviously that's an advantage to have year-round market-sized fish. But also the cost of pumping all that water to refill the ponds was just too expensive. So they went to multiple batch crops where they would seine the ponds 2 or 3 times a year with a seine that would select for the market-sized fish. The smaller fish would be left behind, and then they would understock that with fingerlings. And they just would continually do this and never drain the pond. So this results in very poor water quality conditions after a few years, where you have all this buildup of sludge. And when I talk about water quality now, I'm actually talking about ammonia buildup and nitrite, which is a breakdown product of ammonia. And of course, oxygen. I mean, ponds are self-purifying. You don't really need any kind of aeration in a pond. But if you've pushed it beyond its limit to handle that enrichment, then you may end up with algae blooms crashing and oxygen depletion, and that's where they need the aeration. So what about diseases in the catfish industry? It's been said that about 45% of the losses are due to disease, and with our warm water fish, the majority of those are bacterial diseases. Now, that's not to say that we don't see virus diseases in the warm water fish, but it just has not caused the problems that we've seen in cold water fish. A single bacterial disease, Edwardsiella or enteric septicemia, which is caused by Edwardsiella ictaluri, costs the catfish industry about $20 million a year. And you can see from this slide that our Delta fish farmers, they put the sick catfish right up at the top there, above the scrub cows, the Johnson grass, and the bad young'uns. So what are the major diseases? Columnaris disease, which I'm not going to talk about. It's more of an opportunistic disease that's related to water quality. Enteric septicemia, those two are usually number 1 or 2 every year. Proliferative gill disease, which is a myxozoan parasite that causes inflammation in the gills. And then we have this long list of other problems like winter fungus, channel catfish herpes virus, ick, which is a protozoan, the bulbophorus catfish trematode, they call it, protozoan parasites, visceral toxicosis, which is a botulinum toxin, and then this whole host of other problems that they have, but we can't talk about everything today. The point that I want to get across to you, though, is that we mentioned water temperature before, and in our outdoor pond culture systems, we see a definite seasonality with the outbreaks of disease, and this corresponds to the water temperatures. So in that spring peak and that fall peak, it's where we're going through about 22 to 28 degrees centigrade. And that's optimum for the pathogens, and it's a point where the immune system of the fish is just not able to keep up. This is what ESC looks like. You've got all these different clinical signs ranging from the acute, where you have very few external signs and maybe some focal necrotic areas in the liver, to petechial hemorrhages in the skin. And then as it becomes more chronic, you see more clinical signs like the ulcerations in the skin and then that little catfish fingerling that has the ulcer in the top of the skull. This is very pathognomonic for chronic ESC. So we know that Edwardsiella is an enteric bacteria. It's transmitted horizontally by the fecal-oral route. It initially begins as an enteritis and then spreads to other organs in the fish's body, and it replicates in primarily macrophages, and so it continues on until it causes septicemia. Primarily, you'll see lesions in the liver, spleen, and the kidneys. In chronic ESC, the bacteria actually enters the nares of the fish or the nasal openings, travels up the olfactory tract of the brain where you see a meningitis develop or meningoencephalitis. And then the inflammatory exudate that is formed in the cranium then will ooze out through this fontanelle in the top of the skull that does not fuse in those young catfish. So that forms that typical chronic ulcer that I showed you before. So what about the management of disease in these warm water catfish ponds? Some people have mentioned to me that they thought it was sort of like herd health management, and I guess in some ways it is, but there's a lot of things that are considerably different to me too. One of the things that we have to consider is that the individual fish is not particularly valuable. You know, they're maybe $2 each at harvest, but the population is pretty valuable. So we have, let's just say, a 10-acre pond with 40,000 individual harvestable food-sized fish would be, you know, that crop would be worth $80,000 if they're 2-pound fish, and they're getting $1 a pound for them, which is about what they're going for now. So what we do as diagnosticians is we ask them to periodically go in and sacrifice a few fish just to get information about the whole population, see if we can get some early detection on diseases, particularly if they can find fish that are showing clinical signs. The other thing that's kind of difficult for us is that they're all underwater. We can't really get a good look at these things very often. When they come up to feed, you might get a little bit of a look, but for the most part, they're just not visible to you. And so when we treat, we're treating the entire pond or the entire population and not really treating individuals. So ESC is primarily managed by being aware of the temperature window for ESC, and when you start to come into that range around 20 degrees centigrade water temperature, then you would start looking for it. The person that's in the closest contact with the fish is the person who's out there feeding them. Catfish are fed a pelleted floating ration, so when they come up to feed at the surface, you can get a look at them, and perhaps you can get some early detection that way. Then those specimens would be submitted for necropsy. We would isolate the pathogen and do antibiotic susceptibility. Where we're really at a disadvantage, I guess, with the fish is that we just don't have that many drugs and chemicals in our medicine chest. We have 3 antibiotics that we can legally use, and in some instances we can't even use those. The newest one we have is Aquaflor, which is fluorphenicol. It's available only through veterinary feed directive, and it's only approved for certain diseases. Like if you had a diagnosis of ESC and a veterinarian was in relationship with a client, he could get the feed mill to produce the Aquaflor feed. But there's some catches in here. Let's say the fish are not infected with Edwardsiella Ictaluri, they're infected with Edwardsiella piscicida, which is a newly described species, then, they have to go the INAD route, which is a little more difficult to do. What the fish farmers have done is practice restrictive feeding, because the reason this might work or the reason it does work is, like I mentioned earlier, it's a fecal-oral route of transmission. So when you're feeding the fish, if they're carrying this organism, they'll shed more of it with their feces into the water. So if you stop feeding them or restrict the feed that's going in, they'll quit shedding it, and it stops the transmission. So a lot of people will use that technique. For me, it's a little risky. You really have to know what your water temperatures, your sequence of events, you really have to know if it's a good time to do that. For prevention, we had mentioned earlier that cattle, sometimes it's not really feasible to think about disease-free stocks, and with the catfish, it's kind of that way. We can produce SPF catfish. We do it in our lab every year. But if you put an SPF catfish for ESC out in a pond, chances are it's already there and they're going to get hammered with it. So we feel like vaccination is a better route, for getting prevention. You can practice biosecurity in the hatchery. That'll help you produce a healthier, stronger seed stock, but ESC is so widespread through the industry right now, we feel like vaccination is really the only thing that makes a lot of sense. There is some work going on at different universities, particularly Mississippi State and Auburn, to improve genetics of catfish to breed for enhanced growth and disease resistance. Excuse me. So I'm going to change gears just a little bit and get away from the pond culture side of things and talk about tilapia culture. And tilapia, like catfish, are very hardy fish. They're very resistant to many of the diseases, but we're finding out as we go along that they do have their Achilles heel. Tilapia culture in the U.S. is practiced in these indoor closed recirculating systems, and we showed a picture of those earlier. These are typically greenhouses in the south or southern U.S. In the north and in the Midwest, they're typically closed, well-insulated buildings. To get those tilapia, which are tropical fish, to get them through the winter, you need a way to heat the water and keep the heat in the buildings. The stocking in these systems is very high density, and interestingly, it's a production of all male fish. The reason for that is if you had mixed sexes of tilapia in a culture tank, they mature at a very young age, sexually mature at a very young age. They would start spawning, and when they do that, it just requires a good bit of energy and reduces the growth of the fish. Plus, you get all those offspring in there that'll very quickly crowd the system out. So you really don't want the fish spawning in the system. So they've gone to all male, which is either done with methyltestosterone treatment in the young fish or genetically produced YY super males, they call them. The production is, again, very high, about a half a pound of fish per gallon of water. in these closed systems. And the feeding, which apparently the feed going into the system is the limiting factor as well. So about a pound of feed per 200 gallons is as high as you can go. And again, we're talking now about indoor systems that utilize blown air. We're not talking about pure oxygen going into these tanks. This is an example of a closed greenhouse system on the top there, where you have these large fiberglass biological filters. Most of the filters that are in use today will be two-chambered. The upper chamber will have a little plastic bead that is packed in there to give it added substrate for the bacteria to grow on, to break down the ammonia and nitrite. And then you have to have a mechanism by which that filter can be backflushed to get the solid waste out. And this becomes a real problem because you really don't want any suspended solids in the water. When these systems fail, that seems to be the area where they fail, is keeping the water clear. It doesn't have to be pristine, but it has to have a very low level of particulates in the water. The bottom left there, you see a series of hatching jars. These fish are bred in tanks. The female carries the eggs in the mouth. They're mouth breeders. The eggs are extracted then from the fish and placed in these hatching jars where the water is recirculated through there, and they're allowed to incubate and hatch. Then they're placed in small troughs like that, eventually transferred to hoppas where they're size graded a little bit, and then moved on to some production units. This is what the tilapia looks like. It's really a kind of a nice looking little fish. It's a cichlid, which if any of you have kept aquariums over the years, you know that the cichlids are a very popular aquarium fish. But the species that's used for aquaculture is Oreochromis niloticus, the Nile tilapia. Some people have referred to it as St. Peter's fish, and comes from Egypt and the Nile River. The diseases of tilapia are not as many as we see in the catfish. Like I say, they're somewhat disease resistant, but the ones they have can be very devastating. The worst one is Streptococcus neae. Many of you may not be familiar with this species. It does infect the Amazon freshwater dolphin, which of course is a marine mammal. It's an organism that grows at higher temperatures, just like other Streptococcus bacteria. So it tends to be more of a problem in warm water systems, warmer than usual water systems. It causes beta hemolytic streptococcosis. It causes a meningitis, meningoencephalitis, and some people have referred to it as mad fish disease because with the CNS signs, the fish are spiraling and swimming crazily around in the tank. And there's acute and chronic forms of this disease. Streptococcus agalactiae is another strep that we see in fish, but more in saltwater systems. I know you're more familiar with that organism causing mastitis and things like that, but the strains that infect fish are highly pathogenic, just like Strep neae is highly pathogenic in tilapia. But the common clinical sign that we see with these is infection of the eye, the optic nerve, and the brain. And you'll notice that all those fish have either corneal opacity, hemorrhage in the eye, or exophthalmia. So these are the clinical signs that we look for, along with those behavioral signs of spinning and spiraling. So how do we go about managing Streptococcus in these closed systems? My advice to any new person getting into aquaculture is whatever you do, don't let it get into your system. Practice complete exclusion with this one, because if strep ever gets in a closed system, it's going to be a problem until you just break everything down and Clorox it. It's not going to go away, and you'll have chronic problems. The reason is it's a biofilm forming organism. It's going to be in the filters, in the piping, on the walls of the tank. It's going to be everywhere. So it's really important with this one to practice good biosecurity and quarantine. You can reduce your feeding rates and help a little bit, but what really seems to help is improving the water quality and getting any suspended solids out of there. Strep loves to be associated with suspended solids in the water column. One of the nice things about these indoor research systems is you can use water sterilization techniques like ozone treatment and UV treatment of the water, and this seems to help as well. The thing that that really helps too is reducing the handling of the fish. The grading and handling is a major issue, because any break in the skin is going to open up an area where these bacteria can get in. And again, we're talking about a temperature relationship here with the higher temperatures. So temperatures above 28 degrees centigrade are really bad as far as this one's concerned. We do have approval to treat with antibiotic feeds now. Aquaflora has been approved to treat strep infections in tilapia. The last disease that I'll talk about is kind of a new disease that we have found in tilapia. It's a Francisella. It causes a chronic disease in tilapia. It's an intracellular bacterium. If you're familiar with Francisella tularensis, this thing has many common features to tularensis. Genetically, it's very closely related. The thing that's different is it doesn't grow and live above 30 degrees centigrade. So much of the fish pathogens are that way. They don't grow and live above 30 degrees. We think parasites may play a role as vectors with this rickettsia-like disease as well. If you'll notice that tilapia, we didn't really point out a lot of the internal organs, but that red organ that has all the white spots in it, that's the spleen. It's probably 20 times bigger than it normally would be, and all those little white spots are granulomas. You can actually make a wet mount of the spleen and diagnose it with seeing those granulomas that contain melanin in the center. So the species is Francisella noatunensis. It's a subspecies orientalis, which is just a pathogen of warm water fish, primarily tilapia. It's managed by necropsy culture, and now we have a real-time PCR to detect it in the fish. We want to limit the movement of infected fish. One thing I haven't talked about too much is the fact that a lot of these diseases will go into the fish will be carrying the organism asymptomatically outside the temperature range where we see disease. So this is true of Francisella. When you're outside that ideal temperature range of 25 to 28 degrees, they don't show a lot of sign of being infected. They will eat normally and everything else. Because the it is an intracellular organism that forms granulomas, getting antibiotics into the fish and having those be effective in controlling the disease is very difficult to do. So what we have found is if you can, in these indoor systems where you have the capability of changing the water temperature, if you just increase it to 27 or 28 or above, you will completely inhibit the development of disease from this organism. We do have some vaccines that we developed at LSU. We've mutated the intracellular growth locus C gene, which is involved in intracellular survival in macrophages, and we've created a live attenuated vaccine. The way you vaccinate a fish is to immerse it in a bath of a live attenuated organism. We don't see a lot of injectable vaccines except in the salmon and trout industry. So to summarize or to conclude, my old professor used to say that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's true with fish. I mean, you really have to prevent these things, because once they get into the system, you're just going to have a very difficult time dealing with them. So we like biosecurity quarantine, and we like vaccination, even though there's not a lot of commercial vaccines available yet. But experimentally, we've seen these work very well. It's really important to be observant and anticipate problems before they occur. Daily monitoring and record keeping is extremely important. And then, for a while there, aquaculture kind of had a black eye. They were sort of thinking that maybe antibiotics were being abused in these aquaculture systems, and they didn't like the idea of antibiotics going into the water. But the truth of the matter is, these medicated feeds are so expensive that most of the fish farmers don't even want to use them. They would rather do something else. For example, Aquaflor is about $900 a ton, whereas regular feed is $300 a ton. So that's what they're looking at there. And I've listed some sources of information here. If you are interested in getting any more information about what I've talked about, you can certainly contact me at LSU, and I'll be glad to steer you in the right direction.